So in the initial, after the first meeting in which we just did an introduction and I explained what is the course, right? There are a total of 4 meetings in which we talk about a framework for thinking about urban management policies. And in that framework, policy transfer is central. Now the reason that policy transfer is central is that nowadays governments around the world just hear about policy from everywhere. And it's a huge part of what happens with urban policies, right? There is no field that exists in itself without some influence from outside. There's some policies that are so unique that there's not a lot that you can learn from elsewhere. Think about family planning policy in China, and the one-child policy. These sort of things are super unique for the Chinese setting, but most other policies, I mean, if you want to improve your economy, you want to attract creative professionals, whatever, all cities around the world are doing that, right? So you always make policies nowadays that other cities are also doing, and you're trying to learn from others. So it's a core activity. So what we're doing in these first, after the first week, in the next 4 meetings, and today's the 5th one of those 4. No, it's the 5th meeting of those 4 meetings that come. The last one of those 4. We're trying to develop a framework to think about policy transfer. And we're trying to develop a framework to think about how should you do policy transfer in a good way, and how can you judge if something is a smart idea or not. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about policy, we want to think about improving policy, right? We want to help governments to improve, or we want to improve ourselves, it doesn't matter. Or even if we don't like government, we want to be able to criticize government, then still we need to learn about how should you do it. So to have a position about how should you think about this thing, to have an idea about what is good and what is not good and how to do this is crucial, right? Now, in the makeup of those 4 meetings, in the first one we talked about neoliberalism and competition as the general setting for urban policy development, right? That's sort of the general background. The idea is that all cities are in competition and they all try to learn as good as they can from the outside to improve their situation. That's the general background. Secondly, we focused on transfer in itself, and we said, okay, transferring policies, that's the core of what they do to do this. So city governments go around the world and they pick up elements from elsewhere. But we also said, well, they don't do that themselves actually. There's all these transfer agents. And these transfer agents, they actually try to sell ideas to governments. And they very often have a financial stake. So very often you're talking about consulting firms, right? That want to sell hours of their consultants to city governments. So if you're a consultant, if you're working for McKinsey and you're an expert in creative industries, all these city governments around the world are going to hire you to tell them what to do. There's a ridiculous amount of money to be made there. It's a big industry, right? So these are transfer agents. It's not only people that want to help government, it's people that want to make money by selling ideas, right?
Yes.
It's a business. And then, but next, we said, okay, hang on a second, even if there's policies that work elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you transfer it somewhere, that it will still work, right? And last Friday, we talked about the process of territorialization. And already a week before, we saw that when you talk about transfer, you should always not only look at relations, but you should also look at territorialization. And last week, we looked at that in detail, and we said, okay, this has something to do with the regime that is dominant in a certain place. And that regime will sort of tweak a policy in a certain direction based on the power dynamics in that place. And we used Hong Kong as an example, and we said in Hong Kong, the dominant regime is really focusing on real estate as a means to make money. And in the end, a lot of policies will be reframed in such a way that that regime benefits from it. Which means in the end that maybe the beautiful idea of creative industries, when it's transferred to Hong Kong, will become something totally different. And Hong Kong government will still call it creative industry policies, but actually what they do is something very different. The reason for that is that there's power relations already existing in the place where the policy arrives, right? So this is sort of quite a complex set of ideas. Now the last element that we need to talk about these things is when a government goes somewhere else to see if something is successful, how do they know if it's successful? How do you judge if a policy is good, right? Which criteria do you use to say that's a good idea? Or that idea works well in that place? You need to have some criteria to judge what is good and what not. If you're a policy consultant and a government gives you the task to look in different cities which policies work well, you need to be able to say, we define working well in this and this and this way. And so you first start, okay, working well means it needs to do this, it needs to do that, it needs to do that. And then for each of the cities you're going to look on those criteria how it works. And then in the end you're going to say, okay, based on those criteria, this city does well, that city doesn't do well. In other words, we need criteria to judge success of a policy. That's what we're talking about today. And that's the final element that, together with all these other elements, gives us a framework to talk about policy transfer and how you should advise a government to do policy transfer. And of course, that's what we're going to do in the group project later. Right? So, how are we going to talk about these things? So this is about evaluating practices that work, and especially about criteria to judge if they work or not. And I've used the 3 words deliberation, diversity, and equity, which, if you've read the text, of course, you'll see comes from Veenstein, Susan Veenstein. I could also have used the terms progressive policy and process success, which comes from Marsh and McConnell's paper, right? But both of these papers give us different ways of thinking about success. That's what we're talking about today. How are we going to do that? Well, you by now sort of, in these first weeks, I use a similar structure every time. So I build up what we talk about based on the texts. So the first one, we look at evaluating urban management practices, and we talk about Marsh and McConnell. Second, we'll talk about the judged city. And then third, what we're going to do is I'll present an example of a policy situation. And I'm going to ask you guys to make small groups and to talk about how should we judge success in this case. To sort of employ these texts in a concrete situation, right? And then in the end I will say something about group projects, but that will be very short. Okay, evaluating urban management practices first. The first question is, when are policy practices a success? When do you say that a policy practice was successful? So what are your ideas about this? If you're being asked to say if a policy was successful, what will you look at?
I think a reasonable demands such as work-life education, medical business, arteries, or both ordinary residents and elite class groups can get timely and efficiently solutions. Immediately reports are positive and positively, such as Beijing's 1235 hotline.
Okay, one second. What are you reading now? Which part is that? Which text?
The test 1.
What?
Test 1.
Text 1. Okay.
There is my words. It's my words. For example, the Beijing's 1235 hotline.
Yeah.
Hotline 就是怎么说？if the people have some problem,
Yeah.
She cannot deal with.
Yeah.
She can call the government for help.
Yeah.
The number is 1235.
Sure. What is the policy? But the question is, when is a policy a success?
Yeah.
Because if the people call something wrong, so that's not a success.
Through the hotline, the government earns the people's to support the municipality security at all times. The most important thing is to realize the housing for all proposed by President Xi Jinping.
But still, so what's your answer? When is a policy successful?
Maybe what he means is when a policy practice helps somebody in need.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so when a policy helps somebody in need, right?
Yes.
So then the answer basically is when a policy is a success when the government says this is not a good situation. In order to fix that situation, we're going to do A, B, and C. And if afterwards the situation is better, right?
Yeah.
So this criteria for policy success means, does the policy do what it says it does? Does it actually, because then related to the policy says we're going to fix it like this. The question then is, does the policy fix the problem? First there's a problem, then there's the policy. Does the policy help to fix that? So here the criteria is, does the policy do what the government wants it to do? Right?
All the people feel life satisfaction when this policy rolling out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, sometimes, very often, when there's a government policy and it fixes one problem, it might be good for one group, but not so good for another group. Right?
Yep.
So how do you judge then if it's a success? So, for instance, for the government to fix a problem, it needs to have a lot of money. For that money, it needs to have higher taxation. Maybe that's good for the groups that are held by the government, but the higher taxation is not so good for the business. So maybe the businesses are not happy. Is it then a good policy or not?
I think in terms of size, if you judge whether policy is good or not, that it may depend on your identity and ideology. But whether it's a size, I think it should depend on could it achieve its process its policy goal.
Okay.
For instance, if the tax policy aims to enhance social equality, then we see the outcome whether it helps the people or make a good wealth redistribution.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're adding is, sure, there are different ideas about policies, and that depends on ideologies. But when you look at the success of a policy, you just have to still see if it does what it says it will do, right? So, okay, if that's the case, what do you think of in a situation if you don't agree with the government policy? I mean, you guys, it doesn't matter where you come from. If you're from Hong Kong or from mainland Chinese cities, we're talking about urban policies, right? Municipal policies. If you come from Amsterdam, sometimes the government just makes policy and you hate them. Or you think they're stupid. Or maybe they are partly smart. For some group they're good, but not for you, right? So how do you judge then the success of a policy if you don't agree with the policy?
So the point is that I don't agree, but maybe from some from a social perspective or from a strong interest group's perspective, then maybe they will believe that it's a success. Also, I would say that they made a success for their interests,
Yeah.
for their goals. But sometimes a policy may not achieve the designated goal. For
Sure.
instance, some policy may make everybody unhappy.
Sure.
And that would not be a success.
Okay, so you make a difference between two situations. First, if a policy does not do what it says it will do and then nobody's happy, that's bad. We agree that's a failed policy. But in the situation that a policy does what it needs to do, but it's not good according to some groups, then it's a difficult situation. And you might say, well, the policy is successful given its aims, but I don't like it. Now, one of the reasons why in literature there's a big discussion about this, as you all can understand, as soon as you say that the policy is a success, that's not a neutral remark. That's actually a political remark. Because as soon as you say, well, the policy is a success, the government will say, you see, we did well, we were a success. So saying that something is a success is actually political, right? So this is why a lot of groups who, for instance, are not happy with certain government policies, even though the government is very effective, will say it's not a success. So think about government policy where the government supports real estate industries to demolish a lot of neighborhoods. Well, those neighborhoods are demolished. So the government policy was a success. But a lot of people, a lot of advocates of these groups that were living there are really angry about it. So they will never agree to say this was a success, this policy. Because if they would say that, they would hand the government a support, basically, because saying it's successful is itself political, right? So that's a little bit of a difficult thing. Now, this is just to start a discussion about why talking about policy success is difficult. And actually, this has been quite a long discussion. But as Marsh and McConnell say in their paper, remarkably, actually, well, the success of policy is really important. And under neoliberalism, there has been a lot of attention for ineffective governments and bad governments. Actually, if you look at the attention in the academic literature for what is a success is minor. And very often the answers are pretty different. And they also say mainly the answer is success is if you do what you say you will do. It's a very narrow effectivity-based idea of success. So if we just, as an introduction, if you look at this, the first thing that's striking if you look at evaluation literature, policy success literature, policy failure literature, the first thing that you will see is there's a lot of terminology. It's quite a technical debate. You see all these terms that have meanings and that are a little bit fancy, right? Now, secondly, that's also what Marsh and McConnell say, this literature about evaluation, especially since the 1980s, has become very dominant. Before the 1980s, there was not a lot of attention for the success of governments. And why became it dominant? They say it's partly because it was used to attack government. And it's what in the West was called big government. Well, what does that, I mean, if you would look at it from a Chinese perspective, it might not have been that big a government, but still, if you think about welfare states in Europe in the 1980s, they had a lot of tasks. They did a lot of things. Governments took a lot of tax money away, gave it to other people. They were quite present. They had a lot of policies. And there was a lot of criticism on the effectiveness of those policies, right? So this literature about evaluation was not just neutral, it was not just academic, it was actually really political from the start. It was meant to find reasons to downsize government, right? So, and you can imagine, if you want to argue that the Chinese government in cities, municipal government, should have less influence on cities, the first thing that you would do is show that what these governments do is very inefficient, right? Or they don't reach what they're saying. Well, the government says this and this, they spend a lot of money on it, and look what the outcome is, it's bad. And then you would say, well, look, if a business does that, it would go broke, so a government shouldn't work like that. So it's very political in the first place to look at government success, right? Now, the first way of thinking about it is, does the government do what it promises? And this is typically called a before-after evaluation. So first, this was the situation, then came the policy, afterwards is this situation, you compare afterwards with before. If there's a transformation in the right direction, the policy was a success. That's also what you have been expressing mainly, right? Now, there are a lot of problems with this. For instance, when a government makes a policy, it's not sure that actually the government itself, the policy is the cause of the change. So it might be that while the change occurred, something else caused this. And at the same time, the government made the policy. So for instance, if Hong Kong government wants to develop the creative industries in Hong Kong, maybe already the businesses in Hong Kong want to do that. Maybe they actually take all sorts of actions which causes the improvement of creative industries in Hong Kong. At the same time, the government makes a policy. We don't know if that's actually the reason why that transformation emerged, right? So the issue of causality is really difficult. So, I mean, the same thing goes with government policies for environmental change. Government businesses and societies themselves self-change already. And you're never really sure if the government agency caused the changes. This is very clear, and this is one of the big problems, for instance, in democratic elections. Democratic elections are a lot about the economy and about the economic performance, and people keep voting because they want a good economy. And then presidents or prime ministers keep saying, the economy now is good because I had this and this and this policy. Well, very often, the economy is just good because it's conjunctural. It doesn't have anything to do with the policy very often, right? But the government will still say, we had the policy and because of this it's good. So there is not necessarily a relationship between the policy and the outcome. So that's difficult, right? Because if you evaluate, you want to say the policy was good because the policy caused this outcome. Why otherwise spend all that money on it, right? So that's a problem. There's a couple of other problems. First of all, if you look at goals, is it the aim of the government to reach a certain specific goal, or is it the aim of the government to increase justice in a city? So for instance, and this is a point that's been made in Hong Kong a lot, the government keeps saying they made this policy and that was good, they made this policy and that was good, but people in Hong Kong keep saying, well, if you just look at our day-to-day life is not good. Where do you improve our day-to-day life? And especially the injustice of some groups having a really good life and other groups not having a good life is just outrageous. You shouldn't focus so much on specific policies. You should look much more at issues of justice in a city. And of course, you can make goals out of justice issues. You could say we want to decrease inequality. But the problem is that very often governments don't frame their goals in terms of justice. So that's another issue. Because if they would have to make other policies. Now the causal relation I already mentioned. The causal relation, that's the question of the with or without the policy. So if there's an outcome, would the outcome also have been there without that policy? So very often then they do an evaluation before and after, but at the same time they do the same evaluation in 3 or 4 other cities where there was not that policy, and they see if they have the same outcome or not. That's one trick to sort of find out the influence of the policy. There's another issue, which is called unintended consequences. When you make a policy and you read your goals, I mean, what the policy does is not only cause that outcome, it also causes a couple of other outcomes. The policy is not only responsible for the positive outcome regarding your goals, the policy is also responsible for all the unintended outcomes regarding other things. So if you evaluate a policy, should you only look at if the policy is effective for the things that you said you wanted to do, or should you also include all the negative effects it causes for other things? Since we're thinking not about effectiveness of policy, but success, you could say a policy is only successful if it doesn't cause problems somewhere else, right? Well, you will see that, for instance, a policy that's very good for the economy very often can be very bad for the environment. And then the government starts boosting and saying, look, you see, we've got a very successful policy. But then you can rightly say, well, yeah, if we would include the environmental costs in your policy, it's not so good. So the question, what do you do with unintended consequences, is really important. And then the last question, we already talked about that, is how do you deal with different opinions? One group might agree that it's actually a good outcome, but other people might feel that that's really bad. How do you deal with the fact that people might not agree with the policy in the first place? If you think that policy shouldn't be there, how can it then be successful? Right? So how do you deal in evaluation with the fact that different people have different opinions about a policy? So these are some of the questions that are posed around the issue of evaluation. Now you guys have looked at the paper by Marsh and McConnell, right? So what is the core topic of this paper?
他建了一个成功的政策评价系框架模型。
What is the question that these authors try to answer?
Maybe the main idea is to work out a model to establishing the policy, if success or not.
Yeah. So they want to find. They don't. I don't think they set out to develop a model, but in the end they reach a model, and the model is about, is a policy a success or not, right?
Yeah.
And in the model they say you should not look in a one-dimensional way only at it. You should not look at one criteria only, but there's various types of criteria that you should all include. So what are the three sorts of criteria they include?
Process success.
Sorry?
Process success.
Process success?
And programmatic success.
Yep.
And political success.
So process success, programmatic success, and political success. Now there is a scheme on page 571, which basically summarizes the whole paper. Not the ideas how they got there, but this is the scheme that they developed, right? So what is process success? What is the criterion of process success?
I think the process success covers 4 dimensions as these indicators.
Yeah.
One is legitimacy in the formation of choices. Second is passage of legislation. The third is political sustainability. The fourth is the innovation and influence.
Yeah. So these are all issues relating to the idea that policy making is a process. And in this process, you need to be successful to get a policy at least, right? So, and actually the content of a policy determines if that's possible. So it's not just a process without content. Certain content is necessary to make it successful. And the successful part has to do with legal rules and legal regulations. So in any country around the world, if you make a policy, you need to follow certain steps. And that needs to go legally. And if you don't follow those rules, then afterwards, judges will say that it wasn't legal, so the policy is not official. Which of course would mean that there's a problem, because then the policy can't work. So the first minimal step is at least it needs to be allowed in the way that you do it. But there's more things. They also are saying that in order to get a policy accepted, you need to have a certain political coalition that wants to support it. So the first criteria for success is just that do you manage to make a policy that can get to the finish, and that becomes a policy. And they say that's part of policy process. Now that's only a part, it's not the whole thing. The second thing that they say is the programmatic success. What is the programmatic success according to Marcia McConnell? Yeah, so I think this is closest to what we were talking about before. This is really the outcome of the policy. Does the policy do what it says it should do? Does it do so in the most efficient way? So doesn't the government waste a lot of money? Right, those sort of criteria. So that's programmatic success. So process success is, does the policy, does it manage to reach a policy that's official? Does the policy then do what it's supposed to do in the most efficient way? And then the third step is the political success. What is political success? Yeah. So the argument there is that even if the government does everything according to the rules and gets support within the government system for a policy, and then they execute what they said they were going to do, and they really do what they said and they do it efficiently, then it might be that a big part of the population hates it. Then there's a lot of opposition, which means the popularity of the government will be hurt. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a more autocratic system. If the population is not happy with the policy, that's bad. So can you say that the policy is successful if in the end the legitimacy of the government diminishes a lot? According to Marsh and McConnell, you should include that in your criteria for success. So just to go back to this mask idea, the idea of face masks, introducing face masks is a cheap thing, it's not expensive, and it's very effective to diminish transmission of virus. So in itself it works well. So from a point of view of programmatic success, it's pretty good, right? Also, in most society, to make a policy for face mask wearing in certain settings is allowed. So there is a lot of fights in Europe, for instance, if it's legal for a government to ask a face mask, right? Which is a fair discussion, but to, for instance, ask it in public transit, everybody agrees that that's allowed, right? So it's programmatic success, and it can also be process success. But then still, if like 70% of society in the Netherlands would hate it, then still pushing for that policy, even though it works, and even though COVID might be restricted by it, if the society, because of a silly idea of people not wanting to wear a mask, if the government loses a lot of legitimacy, it's still not a successful policy, right? So these are the three criteria, and Marsh and McConnell stress that success on each of these three criteria doesn't have to be the same. So there's a lot of policies that might have process success. They're introduced easily, everybody agrees, and especially, for instance, because the political parties, you know that policy making very often is groups fighting with each other within a policy process, right? So they might agree, but then in the end, that might be a policy that doesn't work, right? So it has process success, but not programmatic success. The face mask is an example. It has programmatic success, process success, but it doesn't have political success. So you need to look at each of these factors to see if a policy will be successful. That's the main argument of this paper, right? Now I want to take one step back. I just wanted to start with the main argument, but then one step back. How do Marsh and McConnell come to this argument? And that's of course what they write in the pages before this scheme. So how do they develop this argument? Anybody, what are the steps that Marsh and McConnell take to come to this scheme?
they read 2 sets of literature.
Yeah. What's the first? So they read 2
Uh,
sets of literature. The first one.
First one is Bourne's work on public sector improvement,
Yeah.
and the second one is the Bowen's on success, failure, and policy evaluation.
Yeah. So they're basically building up their paper by following the literature. They start with Boyne, and they're saying Boyne is at least explicitly addressing the question, what is success? But they're also saying Boyne is actually only discussing issues of programmatic success. And then they look in a couple of approaches that Boyne mentioned in relationship to programmatic success. Right? Then they look at the second set of literature, which uses the text by Bovens and at Hart. These are Dutch guys. And then they add the issue of, I think, political success to the discussion. And next, they say, well, although that's really good, and it's good that they add political success, they don't have attention for process success. So the addition of process success is the addition of McConnell and Marsh themselves. Right? So those are the steps that you should be able to reproduce in a test. Now, when they discuss Boyne, they explicitly mention 5 approaches that Boyne discerns about success. What are these 5 approaches?
Goal model, system resource model, internal process model, and ability values model.
Yeah. So that's on page 566, 567, right? 5 models. So what is the goal model?
The organization's success is assessed in terms of achieving its goals.
What does that mean? It's very good that you can read it, but what do they mean by that? So achieving goals basically means, do you do what you say you will do? So if the government says, the Hong Kong government says every year in traffic, this is just something I make up, 500 people die. It's way less, but if it's 500, right? This is unacceptable. We want to have a policy to diminish those people dying, and in the first 5 years, we want that at least there's 20% reduction. And we're going to make policies. Then just after 5 years, you're going to see, is that 20% reduction or not? Right? So do you achieve what you say? Now, of course, again, we know that that's a bit difficult because maybe there's many more cars. And because there's many more cars, there is many more accidents also. So although the government managed to reduce the risk, still there are more accidents. So it's not so clear. But basically it is about, does the government do what they say? What is the second model, the system resource model and the internal process model? What do they mean? How do they see success? Yeah, so that's the system resource model, right? Does the agency manage to attract resources to survive? This is a pretty weird criteria for success, actually, and also Marsh and McConnell are clear that they don't like it. What is the argument? If you're a government agency, you're operating in a political field. We all know that politics and also bureaucracies are very political, right? If you're the boss of a department, you need to make sure that your department, that your people remain there, that you're not being demolished or taken over or whatever, right? So the criteria here is, do you manage to keep getting the resources to exist as a department? Now, that's a bit of a weird criteria for success because it's not looking at the outcomes at all, it's looking at your own process. But this is how government departments very often, in bureaucracies, very often think. If our department grows, that's success in itself. It doesn't matter. And the assumption, of course, is if our department grows, we probably will be better in reaching our goals. But that's only an assumption. But that's the system resource model. Did we find the resources to grow our organization? What is the internal process model?
By the internal process model, success is measured in terms of the quality and standard of the internal processes of the organization.
Yeah. So again, this is not about success to the outside. It's still is it successful internally in the way that it does its functions. It's a little bit close to the process criteria, where you look at legitimacy and those sort of issues. But it's still a weird criteria for success. Well, they do exactly what they're supposed to do, but if you have a football team and everybody in the team does exactly what the coach had said, but they still lose with 3-0, is that a success? Well, it's a bit weird to say, well, we did what we needed to do, right? That's a weird way of judging success. So this is why Marsh and McConnell are saying that I think these sort of internal criteria are not the right criteria to judge success. And then they're looking at the last two models, right? The competing value model and the multiple constituency models. What are they?
The competing values model. This is an attempt to synthesize the evaluations of the previous three models.
Yeah. And then?
Yeah. 这是还有很多。And
so it synthesizes the idea of the other three models, but how?
how?
What does it do? Anybody, what do you think that these models, if you forget the difference between these two models, what do they focus on?
就是这个，567，567，对呀，说后边是啥呀？太长了，字都读完了。
Basically, what both approaches are saying is that how you judge an outcome depends on your own position. And it's saying there's multiple value frameworks from which to judge a policy and a policy outcome. And depending on which value you have, so that's the ideologies that we talked about before, depending on those ideologies, you will judge a policy and its outcomes differently. Right? So, and then these two approaches, actually in this paper they're really short about them. And these approaches, one of the two approaches says that it's fundamentally impossible to ever have an agreed opinion about this. The other approach is sort of still believing that that's possible. But they both say that the fundamental problem in evaluation is that there's different opinions by different groups. Depending on which group you are, you will judge the outcome differently. Because you've got a different idea of what the government should do. So the argument there is, if the government policy is a success, depends on what you want from the government. Okay guys, so I told you before, in the end we'll do a sort of case study where I will present the situation of a policy and you need to talk about success. So we're going to apply these three models, but we also need to talk about Feinstein's text first, because she's got three different types of ideas about judging policy. So I want to suggest that we take a break first of 15 minutes and then we continue.
怎么这么快结束了？这得50分钟。
And there's a lot of literature on how in certain democracies there's much more attention for the position of the minority than in other democracies. Right? So I think the issue with deliberation is really, can everybody participate, or every group, every view, participate in decision making? So is every view represented in the decision making? And the reason why they ask this question is that historically it's been proven that if groups are not involved in decision making in a certain way, their view, or the view of some groups, will not be part of the decision making. So the idea here is that if all these views in society are part of the process, then the chances that the outcome will be just are much bigger. Because all these, you'll have to think about these, you have to take them into account. Right? So the idea here is that when the opinion of every group, when there's, for instance, representative groups involved in decision making, and when they can say what they feel, then the chances that there will be policies that are blatantly disregarding some groups become smaller. Right? And the argument is also that decision makers very often don't really, they think they're taking policies that are good for certain groups, but they don't know those groups well enough. So for instance, if you want to make policies that are good for homeless people, you need to understand the world of homeless people. Policymakers very often have all sorts of assumptions that are actually not right. So for instance, it turns out that in Tokyo, homeless people, they don't want government support. They just really, there is a lot of government support. They keep saying they don't want it. They want to be independent, right? So if you want to make policies that are good for this group, you have to include that group in talks about what they want actually. Because otherwise you're going to make all sorts of assumptions for them that are not right. So the idea here is that to have the right knowledge, groups need to be involved, and then to make the right decisions, they also need to be involved. Right? So a society where all groups are included in the decision making will lead to more just outcomes, probably. Not necessarily, but probably. So this is more of a process criterion. So there's two more terms, right? Next to deliberate, and I like the term deliberation more because also in an autocratic government system, groups can still be part of the deliberation, right? So the word democracy directly assumes it needs to be a formal democracy and otherwise it can't happen, and so democracy is better. That's not the way I think it's meant here. It's much, of course, some people will say that's true, but there can also be autocratic regimes that are much more open to groups than other regimes, right? So the criteria to be more open works in every system. So this is why I think deliberation is a more useful term than democracy when you talk about these criteria. Now, what are the other two terms? Diversity and equity. How do these relate to justice? What is equity and what is diversity? Okay, the first term, equity. What is equity? What do issues of equity focus on?
I think according to this essay, the diversity and the equity allows people, or that means allows people in different genders and races to participate in their social activities. That demonstrates that is the demonstrating of justice.
Okay, so what you're now saying, you're focusing on different groups according to what we call their identity. Gender groups, age groups, race groups, all sorts of groups, right? That's generally what we call identity. And that relates to the issue of diversity. So the issue there is that in a city where diverse groups with different identities can all participate in an equal way in the city, they have access to the same things, there's no discrimination for certain groups, they can all participate in what's good about the city, they have access to physical spaces, they have access to work. That's a city with more social justice. So the dimension with diversity is identity of groups. And equality according to identity of groups. What is equity then?
I think the equity is whether you are male or females, whether you are black people or white people, you can take part in some social activities in an equity way.
Okay, so now you're mixing equality with equity. So what you're saying now, that's under diversity. So it's an issue of equality according to diversity. But equity is another dimension. So which dimension is the equity dimension?
I think equity is that everybody share the social resource in a fair way.
Yeah. So equity is, and that's the word equity in English, is about economics. It's about the differences in class groups. It's about the fact that everybody can benefit financially from what the city has to offer. And that different income groups have the same sort of access to what's good in the city or not. So a city with higher inequality in Gini coefficient, which of course is about economic groups, has less social justice. So the idea here is that if inequalities, financial inequalities, get too big, a city cannot be just. So where the liberation is about political equality and diversity is about social equality, equity is about economic equality. These are three types of equality. And the idea is that a city with more equality is more just. So this means that basically inequality is seen as unjust by Susan Feinstein. She doesn't say that there can't be inequality, but it shouldn't be to the point where it excludes groups from certain things. And especially, for instance, if there's financial inequality or economic inequality, and that translates also into social inequalities, that's really bad. Right? So how would you use these three criteria if you want to evaluate urban management practices? So if you look at the success of government policies through the eyes of Susan Feinstein, how do you talk about that? So that can be a test question. Which three criteria does Susan Feinstein introduce to think about the urban social justice in cities? And how can you use that to evaluate policies?
To benefit relative disadvantage the social group of society from income
Say again?
try to benefit relatively disadvantage the social groupers, such like lower income.
Yeah. So she mentioned Rawls, who is one of the big writers about inequality. Rawls on which page is that? Page 6. And the difference principle. And Rawls there says that policies can only benefit the rich if they benefit the poor more, meaning that policy should always diminish inequalities. So basically, these are three dimensions of inequality: political inequality, social inequality, and economic inequality. For Susan Feinstein, the question becomes, if you evaluate a policy, does this policy increase or decrease political inequality? Does this policy increase or decrease economic inequality? Does this policy increase or decrease social inequality? The idea is that policies should decrease inequalities. And if they don't, they're not good policies because they make the city more unjust. Right? Now, this is something you don't have to agree with this, right? There's a lot of people who don't agree with this. There's a lot of people who feel, especially people that really believe in capitalism, they say that's ridiculous because capitalism works because it does not believe in equality, right? So it's up to you to agree with that or not. But this is how Susan Weinstein thinks about it, and she feels that way too much government policies are there to actually support capitalists, and that a lot of problems emerge because the government doesn't take enough responsibility to protect people from capitalism. So that's her opinion. Okay, now I've said that we've got about 20 minutes left, a little bit less. So I said we're going to do a little case study. I'll walk you quickly through it so that then you can talk about it. The case study comes from India. And it's in Mumbai. There is an area along Mumbai is a city located at the water. Along that water is a waterfront. And this is what it looks like. And it's called the Citizens Promenade. It's a project that was developed in 2000, and it replaced the city waterfront as it was before. And you have to talk about the justice or the effectiveness of that policy, right? And of course, justice and effectiveness, or justice and success, are two different things. Now, what are we talking about? This is the location of Bandra. Mumbai is in the west of India, along the water, and this is just a very small part. This here is a very small part of Mumbai. It goes all the way up, and then this here is Bandra. And Bandra is a place where you must have heard of Bollywood, the movie center. A lot of the Bollywood stars are living in Bandra, but you have to imagine in India everything is a little bit of a mess, right? So even if there's Bollywood stars, that doesn't mean that the street can still be a mess. I mean, there's no pavements, whatever, which in a way is also exciting. It's just different, let's put it that way. So this is specifically, and then this is the bandstand here, this is Carter Road, and this is the bandstand. These are the two areas where they developed this waterfront promenade. So this is what it looked like. So waterfront sounds really nice, but it's here, this is where the sea is. It can come all the way till here. And what happens is there's a lot of people living in these sort of shacks. You have an imagination that there's a lot of really poor people living in Mumbai. They came from the countryside, they went to the city, and they're living in illegal structures. They're living wherever. There's not really a government policy to do something about that either. So in Mumbai, in the city, about 60% of people live in illegal houses, right? This is not always houses that they build themselves, of course, because also there's a whole building industry for illegal houses. So there's people making money, mafia and real estate owners making money for building illegal houses. So the whole idea of legality, which of course in China there's not a lot of things happening that are illegal, well in Mumbai the whole definition of illegality is different, right? So on these waterfronts there were all these groups. And these groups are also, they're not rich, and they're making their money on these places where they live also, right? So they're living there, and then here they drive loads, and there's also a lot of fisher people. So what is this situation? I will run very quickly through this. But Mumbai is a city of extreme inequalities. Many people are really poor, and they just stay in public spaces because they don't have a house or whatever. They just stay there. And then also, these public spaces are not safe for women at all. So safety for women especially is a huge issue. There are a lot of problems with rape, with molestation of women. It's just a big issue, right? And the Bandra Waterfront project is initiated by middle-class residents in these areas to take back these areas and make them safe again, right? And what happened? These Bandra waterfronts were then redeveloped, and actually the women from these neighborhoods afterwards say these areas are much safer. We now dare to walk outside again. It's really good. So this is what it looks like after the development. So this is actually when it's really good. So you just have to re-imagine a little bit what things look like. There's still people here living. There's still people having their work here. But these are the waterfronts. These are these promenades where you can walk, and where a lot of the middle-class women from these neighborhoods feel that they can safely walk now. They can meet their friends again, and they dare to go there. Now, at the same time, there's all these regulations. You're not allowed to park, you're not allowed to eat, to drink. You know how that goes. All these developed spaces, very often they've got regulations of what you're not allowed to do. And then also it's being sponsored by businesses. Now, one of the things also is what the neighborhood groups and these middle class groups are especially living in these sort of houses. These are upper middle class housing, so this is really good housing. And the neighborhood groups there are especially also very worried about what they call antisocial behavior. Now, India is an extremely conservative country when it comes to male-female interaction. So this is seen as antisocial behavior. Sitting next to each other already, walking hand in hand is antisocial. If you're walking hand in hand with somebody, the public can really get angry at you. And actually a police officer can come to you and say, why do you do that? Right? So any sort of physical contact is already sensitive. So, and then you can say this guy here is looking back at these two guys just walking hand in hand. Like, why are they walking hand in hand? So what you see here is this is a space where middle class group like this couple feel they can have what they call modern ways, whereas at the same time other people feel they can't. So clearly there's all these social conflicts in this space, right? Women feel it's safe here, but then other people feel like, why are these women walking around here? So there's a lot of conflict there. So the question for you guys is, how would you assess this policy of building these streets and these spaces? Is it a policy success or not? And is it increasing social justice or not? So can I suggest that maybe you guys, instead of doing this in a whole discussion as a group, that you maybe split up in smaller groups and discuss together what you think of that? So maybe just turn around and with a group of 6 or something, or 7. Or talk about something else. The question is, this policy, is it a success or not? And why would you say it's a success?
就是说这个，你要用，你要评价它这个，评价。是的。啥玩意儿？讨论啊，讨论你说。为什么这个？为什么这个？
这啥问题？
不用，就一个问题。
一个问题。
可以用这个维度，也可以用这个维度。
这啥维度啊？这是？
第一个就是它那个，就是决策过程，然后还有没有达到目标，政治上的成功，这第一篇的那个维度，就是刚刚那篇。
怎么听不到？
我觉得，
上，
我觉得
啥维度？
讨论，大佬说讨论，大佬。
我觉得很难用。
我只是听不到。
有啥建议？
我听一下。
我觉得很难用第一个，我觉得很难用第一个来讨论啊，就是 process 跟 political 怎么，它这里面的信息都不够吧？
我没看这篇。不要问我。
你如何？
这个你
他说的是问买的。
你刚才交易的时候，他跟你讲了这个，你
就是说他不能在两个手牵手这样向走，不然糟了。
Nice to meet you too.
就是很高兴见到你这里的嘛，高哥，对不对？
怎么样评估这个政策的？
他是说什么？
就不能手牵手，就不能不能两个人在一起交谈。
他就一直在跟你说明这个东西，说明项目刚孟买这个，你刚才交易一句没听，
这重点没吃过了呀，关键时刻。
说的是男女之间有互动。就是因为这个社会很大，有一些
它不是有种姓制度，
有一些比较潮流的新派的，有一些老派的。这个老派的人很保守，新派的人。
我给你再讲一遍啊，首先，我觉得建一条这个滨海路嘛，滨海路，因为这滨海路周围在海边嘛，就有人在这住，在工作，这是底层人，
就是非法的。
然后一开始他们觉得没建之前，女性都不敢在这些地方走，因为危险。但现在建了之后赶走了，这个也挺漂亮的。
但是还是有垃圾。
他们也不带我，但他还在这里住。然后对啊，还是有垃圾嘛。这两张图片讲他设置了一系列这些规矩，
就问那两个问题啊。
不能做这个，不能做这个。然后这是有企业赞助。
是不是讨论那两个问题？
是，我听完。前戏还没完，等一会儿。
然后这个就是他讲的是印度是保
这个龙哥讨论。
就手牵手，有些人看的是反社会主义。 做两张图，就是为什么能手牵手就没了，然后你要开始评价。
应该是拿
评价
这两个文章的一些
用这两个维度，就是他刚才讲的，一个是 process programmatic， 还有这是第一篇的那个，有张表可以给你。然后第二个那个就是刚刚那个社会的政治的经济的那个维度评价。
评价他的政策是否成功。
我觉得用第二
个呢好点，有政治社会经济，
政治吧，
文化，
社会经济文化，
人文，
那不就是文化吗？
就是
democracy，
民主
里边有吗？民主
吗？
就是那个 deliberate，
等一下。
deliberation，
determination，
不是那个什么经济什么呀？
这是
政治，
这是
社会
deliberation，
这是社会，是经济，不是economy这种经济的。
他讲的就是经济，就是他这个 equity 指的就是
平等，
不同的人在获取这个资源上的这个途径上是公平的，所以就是跟经济有关系。
社会。
土豪。
是政治吧，这个 deliberation， 就是讲这个决策的时候有没有让尽可能多的人参与进来，就是你越民主参与这个决策，是不是代表你这个政策越有可能是公平的，是公平的，
是决策是正确，是成功的。对啊，那就是这个就是说，这个就是大家都同意建一条跑道，尤其是女性，对吧？然后第二个是
还有啥看这个政策，它是否是倾向于穷人？如果是穷人多一点的话，就比较稍微平等一点。
他的但是我是解决大多数人嘛，不一定是
穷人不是大多数人吗？富人肯定是少数人。
就是我服务的人，穷人也可以去啊，只要是对于这个受益的，那不都是成功的吗？他管他穷人还是富人呢？你如果沙滩修好了，你富人可以去，你穷人也可以去。
但是对于这条路来说，穷人就修这条路对穷人来说有什么不同吗？
为啥呢？他只是说对，现在是占领了，就跟城市更新一样嘛。我占领了原先本来我可以在这睡觉的，你现在给我修成路了，我没有睡觉了。那对于我来说可能就是不成功，
更小了。
对啊，那对于我来说公平的，是不成功的，对啊。但是对于整个社会来说，对于大部分人来说，他还是不管是有钱还是没钱，我都可以用这条路去欣赏比较美的景观，去旅游，去休闲。这不就是一个成功的政策吗？
我操，这他妈要是考中文的话，我书都不看了，我书都不用看。
是这个意思吗？
你可以这么说，你可以接着说下去。
然后还有什么？这就是第一个嘛，对啊。
没有，这个应该是，这个不是第一个吧？
看哪个？
建议哪个？
第一个是
其实还没懂。
你可以接着说，你可以接着说。
不怎么懂，我还不怎么理解你在说什么。
不是现在不是就是说这个通过这叫什么社会
多样性
diversity
啊，这是多样性，这是什么来着？
就是民主，这个他一开始用的是民主
deliberation，
他觉得
文章里面是这个，
对，但是他觉得
应该是自由民主，自由的，
就是反正就是让
应该类似于 democracy，
就是你是中文的，
民主，
多样性，
平等
是这个。
对啊，这个他说的就是刚才就那个傅毅解释的嘛，他不是说他本来要解释这个 equality， 然后他说他和这个 diversity 还是什么混，是吗？
不同肤色。
对，是他说的是这个吗？老师指的是这个意思吗？
对啊，就是不同身份嘛。
白人、黑人，有钱的、没钱的嘛。
有钱的、没钱的。
对啊，就是多样性嘛。有钱的、没钱的。
对，然后平等是都可以享受这个资源，同等的那个。
就是你这个说的是不同的肤色的人、不同贫富差距的人都可以享受这个资源，那你下面还是
不是这个就是 financial， 这个是指比较 financial。
这讲的是经济上这个
资源，我可以有同等的渠道去享受这个资源。
比如说国家有个政策，创业公司给50万，那是不是不管富人还是穷人，他都可以拿？
都可以，那这现在是平等嘛？
对。
这俩有模糊了，这样一说，是吧？现在说的同一件事，但是我把俩点都说了。
它还一点点区别吧。
他是说你可以不同意这个标准，他没说你一定要同意，他就是一家之言。
然后还有第一个 第一个咋说呀？
Okay, guys.
我可以改死了。
I know it's pretty late already. It's 10 to 8, so we need to stop in a second. So I just wanted to quickly hear some of your opinions how you would deal with a case like this if you have to evaluate success. So if you would talk about this case of Mumbai and developing this waterfront, if you would look through the eyes of Marsh and McConnell, how would you judge the success?
中文的，你把我给翻译了吗？你把看到我说的中文，然后你说英文就完了。
根本不知道你说啥，太搞笑。
就是大家不管穷的富的，我都可以走这条路。虽然说侵占了少部分人的穷人的这个权利，居住权利。
From the Marsh McConnell's materials, for instance, we first discuss whether it is, has a legitimate process of decision making.
Right.
And then we see the programmatic materials to see whether it fits its goals or and whether it effects of the policy. And then we see the political aspect to see whether it is social justice.
So if you would look at this case through the eyes of Marshall McConnell, you would use their scheme. And then if you would answer a question like that, I would always say like, well, I don't know the content of the answer to that question because I don't know if it was legal the way that this plan was developed. And knowing India, very many things are not so legal when they're being developed, right? So you don't know. But that's what you would do. You would first of all see, was it established, this plan, in a legal way? Was there enough support? Yes, because it's developed. But the fact that it's there partly shows that there was process success, right? And then next, the question, well, does it have programmatic success? Well, actually, this promenade is built as the plans were. And there was not a lot of money used, so it was quite efficient also. So from a point of view of programmatic success, yes, there was also success. And then from the point of view of political success, I would point at the fact, and of course you need a little bit more information there, but I would point at the fact that there's actually quite diverse groups involved here. And that some of the groups are really not so positive. So for instance, for the building of this promenade, they needed to push a couple of these illegal groups away, right? Those groups were living there. They didn't have anywhere to go. And also those groups were making money there, right? So for them it was not good. So they're not happy. But the middle class groups that were living there, they like it because they've got a safe space. Women like it because it's really safe. So for the political success, you could say, well, there's a mixed opinion about this project. And then it just depends on how the overall balance between these groups works out. If the vast majority agrees with it, it's political success. If there's too many people that are really loud about the fact that it's bad, there's probably no political success. And you don't know if that's the case. So you can just say, I cannot judge the content, but that's how I would think about it, right? So now take another look. Look through the eyes of Feinstein. How would you talk about this if you would look through the eyes of Feinstein? So how would Feinstein look at this? Anybody?
53个。你不知道说啥。
I think from the perspective of diversity, the program contribute to the city. Because I think the allows different groups and different age of people, different yes, or whether you are poor or whether you are rich, you can go to the you can benefit from this public space policy. So I think from the perspective of diversity is still good to the city. And I can't find some ideas from the perspective or democracy.
Okay, anybody else that wants to add to this? How would Susan Feinstein evaluate this project?
Satisfaction. Maybe you would have to know whether the decision is made by satisfaction. We don't know the exact message, but since the provision might brief majority has people and they may not be interested in having this kind of
No.
Yeah, so I think the majority would be happy to see this projection. And also in terms of social equality, obviously the middle class are more willing to see this first, the poor, the lower class are not willing to see.
Yeah.
And also the second part is about the economic equity. It seems that this policy it serves the middle class interests at the expense of all those small people away.
Yeah.
So that I think from instance she will not practice this.
Yeah. So basically if I would get such a question, I would always first state the general way in which Susan Feinstein would think. And I would say Susan Feinstein would ask the question, does this project increase the social justice in the city or not? That's the most basic thing. And next I would say Susan Feinstein would then judge that on 3 criteria. Does it increase or decrease political equality, economic equality, and social equality? And then the individual answers to each of them, I would answer like you've done. So I would say, well, for the political equality, we don't know, because we don't know who was involved with the decision making. But knowing India a little bit, probably the poor groups were not involved in this decision making. That's what you could say. And even you can leave that last bit away. We just have to find out. So I don't know. But if some groups would not be involved in the decision making, then that's not politically equal. And it is a fact that in India, middle class groups have good access to decision making, and poor groups do not have. So actually, there is no political equality there at all. But if you don't know that, you don't have to say that. And then for the social equality and the economic equality, I would say, well, these are different dimensions, and they point in different directions. And it depends also on which group you look at. So for instance, if you look at middle class women, obviously this project makes their life much better. It creates a safe place for them. But if you look at poor women, it makes their life worse. Yes, they're women and there's a safe space, but they lose a lot of income because of this. So whereas if you look at the social side of it, it might increase equality, but then on the economic side, it actually decreases equality. So Susan Feinstein probably would say, this is a mixed project. And of course you need to know the details really to know in detail how that worked. If part of the plan would have been to rehouse the people that were living there, the poor people that were living there, and to give alternative housing to them, and alternative economic space, then the project would have been much more inclusive and much more equal for everybody. Then you could really say that increases the just city clearly. But because it's increasing social equality at the cost of poor groups, that's actually maybe making it a less just city. But there's clearly that different directions don't go together here, right? So these are two ways in which you can talk about evaluating policy, where, as you can see, the first one by Marshall McDonald is much more focused on the policy itself. And the second one is much more positioning that policy in a wider framework for judging policy development, and if it's just or not. Okay, so we're going to talk further of how you can use these policies in actual analysis later. But I said I would say something about what's going to happen next. So looking ahead at the group projects, there's now two strands. We still never have met for the tutorial groups, right? Now the reason for this is that it's much easier to talk about the tutorials when you know what the framework for the analysis is. So and also this year it's very unclear when everybody would be in class because of all the quarantines and the visa things and everything. So I thought if we just do the first meeting for the tutorial groups late, that's easier because then everybody's in the classroom, right? But the tutorials will take place in week 6, right? So this week is week 5, so that's next week. There's one group which is on the Wednesday, and there's one group that's on the Friday night. So that's really the fun group because that's after the lecture on the Friday from 8:30 to 10:30. We're allowed to do presentations. Yay! Awesome. So that's the two groups. But we'll do the introduction to what's actually going to happen in week 6. Now, you really need to be at that tutorial meeting. Why? We're going to explain what's going to happen, and you're going to be part of a group approach. We're making groups. Everybody has to be in a group of 6 people. Yeah? So you need to make groups of 6. Now, there's one issue with this. If you look at the tutorial group, one tutorial group has 27 students, and one group has 21 students. That's not good because that means that in the one group there need to be 7 people in the project and in the other 5. So I want to transfer 3 students from the Friday night group to the Wednesday afternoon group. Right? So that there's 24 in both. Now I do realize that you want to be part of groups. So what I want to ask is if there's 3 volunteers that want to move from the Friday to the Wednesday, send me an email. Right? So if you want that, please send me an email in the next 2 or 3 days. If nobody sends an email, I will have to pick some people, which is always awkward. I'd much rather not do that. Okay? So I had a couple of slides of that, but that's hardly anything. So there is 4 groups of 6. That's the first thing. Everybody needs to create a group of 6 people. Now, of course, you need to make sure that you're together with those 6 people in tutorial of the Wednesday or the tutorial of the Friday. Now, I'm totally fine if you want to switch. If more people want to switch from the Wednesday to the Friday or whatever, because you want to be with groups mates that you want to work together with, right? But then you just have to find somebody yourself that wants to switch with you. If I receive an email from you guys, hey, I'm now on the Wednesday group, but I want to be in the Friday group, and somebody from the Friday wants to switch with me, I'm happy to organize that. But it needs to be a couple so that every time, because otherwise you cannot just go to the other group, right? If you're not on the list for the Friday, you cannot come to the Friday, because we need to have 24 in each group, right? So there's 2 things. First of all, I'm looking for 3 students that can switch from Friday night to the Wednesday. And then if other people want to switch because you want to be together with friends in a group, you just have to organize it yourself with other people that are, because there must be people that want to switch from one way to the other. Anyway, that needs to be, these switches need to be organized before the first meeting on Wednesday, not coming Wednesday, but the week after. So if you want to switch, you have to organize it this week. Yeah? So what are the topics? We'll talk more about this in the first meeting, but there's 4 topics, 4 areas that you can look at. It's either tourism, housing, art, or transport. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to be a consulting team. And either you're working on tourism, housing, art, or transport, and you have to pick a client city yourself. You can choose whichever client city. And you can say, this is a problem in this city. We're going to look at practices around the world. So if you're with 6 people, there's 1 person that looks at the client city. So that means there's 5 more case study cities that you can look at because you're with 6, right? So there will be 5. So for instance, you're going to look at traffic congestion in Beijing, and the question if rapid buses can fix that problem. So you're within transport, you choose Bangkok as your client city, and you choose bus rapid transit as your precise topic. Then you have to pick 5 case study cities where they have a best bus rapid transit system and evaluate if that's working or not. Right? So you pick 5 cities around the world, and each of you then does one analysis, and then you make conclusions about what is smart for Beijing to do. That's sort of very roughly what the system is for the project. So the challenge is you are part of a consulting team that is hired by a client city to give an advice about an urban management challenge in the city. You have to study the issue in the client city and then research 5 case study cities and translate your findings into an advice. Choosing the precise challenge within your topic and the client and case study cities is part of the group project. So the group has to choose the client city, the case study cities, and the exact topic that you look at. But of course, I will talk with the groups on how to do it. And then the meetings in week 2 to 5 help to provide a framework for that analysis. So you need to use the material that we'll be talking about in these weeks in your group project. We will talk about that further, how you can do that. Now I know that this all now at this moment maybe sounds a little bit abstract, but as soon as you've seen one presentation, you'll understand how it works. Okay? So these are, if you talk about the framework for the group project, these are the conclusions that we've drawn from the meeting so far. So there's new strategies for governance or the neoliberalism, which means that all cities are in competition and that cities are acting entrepreneurial. That's what we said in week 2. So learning from other cities means that you find best practices and you try to transfer this from one place, but there will also be territorialization. That was week 3. Now, inter-territorialization, regimes play a crucial role. That was last Friday. And then today we talked about, and last Friday we also talked, we talked about the week before. This should be week 3 already. But also learning does not have to be about learning from the West. So if you're going to do case study city, to be honest, I think it's smartest because you all know the Chinese setting really well, right? Choose a client city in China makes sense because then everybody who does a case study city understands the client city, right? But then choosing your case study cities, I would choose also a lot of cities in Asia, also maybe outside, but also in Asia, so that you can learn from different places. And then today we talked about how there are multiple criteria to judge success. Whoa. So, this is just a very quick introduction. We'll talk much more extensively about this in the first tutorial meeting, where we will also make the groups. So then it will be much clearer what actually you're supposed to do. But the first tutorial meetings are week 6. These are the 2 dates for the first tutorial meetings. So TY1 and TY2, I don't know why they call TY1 and TY2. It must be tutorial. Why? Why not just T1? I don't know. That's really weird. Anyway, TY1 is on the Friday, 8 October, 8:30, in the same room where we will be anyway. So that's the good thing about being on the Friday is you're there already. The downside is you've just had this meeting already and you're going to continue till 10:30. The Wednesdays are 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's a daytime class. So if you have to work during daytime, obviously you can't do that. And that's first one is on 6 October. So, and the last thing I told you already, there need to be 3 volunteers that want to switch from TY1 to TY2. So they want to switch from the Friday night to the Wednesday afternoon. Okay, that was today. Does anybody have questions? I promise you that it will become more clear, and then it will be really clear what you need to do when you've done it. Okay, guys, if there's no questions, then we'll meet again next week, Friday. Enjoy your National Day on Friday, I would say. I don't think there's anything happening. No fireworks, I think, again.
不是，他这个 presentation 下周开始啊。
没有，下周组队跟选题吧。
哦，那这去呀、
跟咋办？
去
带去考试。
你不玩好了怎么考试？先要放空身心。
别玩了，真的别玩了。
放空身心。不是，他还说什么要怎么着要重新分队了？
你去？
没啥事儿吧？没别的事儿吧？
我有你好像没有。我5509有。
我基本上什么都是跟上午分开的，就你一个很低。
6803不是
？6803，不是10号那天呢？
图书馆走，图书馆那对啊，走。
我说5509，我说5509第7周我有
是不是晚上？
去啊！走，我待会儿还没吃东西，操！
去吧。
有学习就好了，吃啥东西？
不吃晚饭。
对呀。
学习是我快乐。
然后精神上倒是被喂饱了。
那他肯定是说，怎么说他是要把那个为什么调到周三，周五调到周三？
对啊，他问有没有人。
那就是正常不是总6个人吗？
对，就这样6个人。
什么意思啊？
都是周五晚是吗？对呀，我知道呀。
哦，就是有些人是不够，这不是6个。
所以我们不就是下周上完课就要接着上土车了哟，对吧？对呀，没错。好的。
对，可以，上面。
其实我觉得他那个周3时间也高，他下午，
而且是在这个楼。
对，而且上完之后晚上才上课，就也不会。
不然中午干嘛呢？中午还要放一天。
中午就得晚上上了呀。
对呀。
哪个出门？不好意思。那，我怕我手机。
你哎，手机不要了，准备破13是吧？一会儿给你写一个13。
巴黎。
你找来了？找半天找哪儿去了？
找啊！你说我直接从图书馆上去。
他玩的是他玩的是里边的时候。他他妈穿个红色的裤子，这4角大的会中文没人儿，会中文说话是不是？习这么紧，还要请回家？对，就是我。一会儿把5块钱拿来。什么信息了吗？啊？还说是哎，不是不是，我哪去课了？咱那课名怎么着？那课成名他妈什么名干？什么后边就跟他们，后边跟他们一组。拿到去，我说你忙啥了？我在家里。啊，你在图书馆学习啊？在图书馆学习。咱那天一个8人，不是妈的，我所有的课都跟他俩一起，我操！你还得有人那什么呀？这怎么？有骂我。我还好，咱们那是过2周嘛。
我以为你们好了。
没有啊，跟学几个人嘛？我准备了几天，人家管现在考试，他妈的考试嘛，你晚上跟他说一下，发个邮件给他。
不是B卷好，B卷你就记住就行了嘛，就背就完了嘛。不用搜，哎，不是 B 卷其实好，B 卷有个开卷好，开卷你搜都不知道去哪儿搜。B 卷你只要把它记住就好了，你背下来就好了。老师说出来就是对的，你听老师的就好了。他说 B 卷好，B 卷好，B 卷好。说啊？中南？不是北京管，不是中南。北京城的。 推着我车，我要回去是吧？是吧？是吧？我是大伟。大伟，哦，我是大伟。哎呀，你不能洗是吧？谢谢啊。多少多少？
你去吗？想去。没去。他说你答应他好多次都不去。对呀。
我每次都很想去，但是不是不是。
去吧。
让我纠结一下。
10号。
这还有什么事情？
这作业得拍一下啊。
你看一下。
不给我的票。这梳理一遍吧，但是有点乱，现在开始。那现在看这504它是10月20号是 presentation 什么时候啊？他已经说了还是没说？504的 presentation。presentation。天哪，那也不考虑了。然后6804没有。对，那就没事。6803。 想好多。
好贵啊！不是你自己吃那东西，你自己去。
你都不懂啊，你不知道去哪儿。
你不知道查不行啊？小红书那些不是查。
那这还不知道。要是懒得去就无所谓了。
我们几个去多好。
你看往返交通只要50块钱。
不是，他这个有人工费的。
肯定要倒不会的。那是属于自发的，不会有人费的。
你听我，龙哥，你们自己去。吃饭现在就想吃饭，就可以。上午啥东西？上午吃6万元，太贵了。
然后是，对，含导游费了，可能是纯导游费，然后那个船费、午餐、保险、小费、午餐、保险。对。其实反正这几次基本上都是300左右了，因为你要有吃饭，要有那个车、船，它这就是游玩路线，应该没有什么特别难的。但是它这个岛上其实要1-2个小时，你看走完全程只要2.5个小时，拍走停花了4-5个小时，说明半天不够，它也不是很大。那如果说我们真的要吃的话，可以从岛上回来了再吃，不用在岛上吃呀。如果说那你不想在那儿吃啊？不是，我看它吃什么呀？反正这块儿目前看就是这些，因为都是属于自发组织的，就没有那种说赚钱的嘛。所以从就单从性价比上来说，应该是要更合适给那个咨询报团。他这个就是主要是有那个总主任的费用类似。你要怎么去？你要去吗？去吗？
去知道。我说自己去啊，跟他们去没劲啊，就是30岁的3-4，对。为啥工作语言这个？他们跟我有孩子，我跟他们去写。这个，你就听我，要么就不去，要么你就自己去，要么就是咱自己组织去。把少侯他们喊上吗？你自己妈跟我合力喊住，不好啊。
问题不大。如果可以去的话，我们也可以自己去，我觉得也可以。
可以自己去。
也不会花很多钱。不是，主要是不是钱的问题，是你发现出问题，这个有可能出问题。
不会有问题，你去。
这有可能是我每次去的出问题。
我们去休闲，不是去度假，我就冒险。
也发现出问题，这情况怎么对孩子下面教？
我保证，注意我们休闲。
你负起全责任呐，你负全责任。这不是开玩笑的呀，你负的学校里边，这是去野外了。
我去过，我们也去过，经常去他们沙滩，就是我跟你发的。
沙滩没用，这种海可能就没那些好的没用。你教育这个里边教没办法。
我说沙滩就是我经常去那个舞蹈，我们自己去那个岛。这几挺好。
谢谢我去。我拿走。
太后悔了，刚才有。我们月有个办好像国庆初一好像有活动。你听我的没错，自己去。
安全第一，安全第一。
我已经去探险。
这不是探险问题，万一出问题怎么办？
我跟你说，天气有问题，要保证你自己的一个绝对没问题。
一定要有熟人，你熟人没法去。
熟
录给你看。